Today I saw a documentary that I had been looking forward to for quite a while. Um, this film was called Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World, and it was directed by Catherine Bainbridge and co-directed by Alfonso Moriana. Catherine Bainbridge also did Real Injuns a few years ago, which was about the investigating the stereotypical depictions of Native Americans in or Native. She's from Canada. Does that count as Native American? I don't know the tribe. Indigenous people um, in cinema. And I actually did not see that documentary. I think that came out in that weird year where I was living in the back of my parents' house and I missed a lot of things. So I'm going to have to seek that one out because I really enjoyed this film. This was a look at the way in which Indigenous people of America, how their music really were the foundational roots of jazz and blues and rock and roll and hair metal and all kinds of things and folk. And I thought it was really fascinating. I liked the way it was structured, that it wasn't a timeline. It was structured by looking at a handful of individuals that were cornerstones in these various parts of the arts, and really establishing how their native roots turned them into artists and how their artistry then affected other artists. I thought that those through lines were really well done. I really enjoyed a lot of the interviews they had. They had interviews with some people who were still alive, like Robbie Robertson from the band and Buffy Sainte-Marie and some of these others. Then they had interviews with people who played with some of the people who are now dead, like Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal being the interview, not the person who's dead. And then like they had Jimi Hendrix's sister. I was like, wait, what? That was kind of cool. And it also had a lot to say, not just about music, but about obviously the sociology of our country and a little bit Canada and the basic awful racism that is inherent and systematic in our country, and you can't escape it in any facet of our society. It's just always there. One interesting part where they were looking at a couple of musicians from the Southeast, including Link Ray, who wrote Rumble, that the documentary is named after. Interesting enough, Rumble, it was the first all-instrumental song to be banned from the radio because they thought it would cause teen rebellion just from how badass that like music was. I think that's amazing. So they were talking. The part I particularly thought was fascinating was when they were talking to some musicians from Louisiana who were Choctaw, and how the Choctaw people, at a certain point in American history, it was easier to survive in this country as a black person than it was to be Choctaw. So a lot of Choctaw passed as black rather than native. They also talked about the history of how so many black Americans have like a great grandmother who was native because of the way in which the native men were separated from the women, and then the slaves that were brought in were mainly men, and that leaves you that mixture. And I found that really fascinating because I didn't really know much about the history of Eastern Native people. I knew quite a bit about California, partly from growing up in California, partly because my father is an archaeologist dealing mainly with Native American archaeology. So I knew quite a bit about California tribes and quite a bit about the Modoc tribe. If you ever want to know anything about the Modoc tribe, I can tell you about that. But I didn't know a lot about the East Coast, and definitely did not know a lot about the South, other than, like the Trail of Tears and some of that like highlight stuff that you learn in high school, because this country doesn't teach about its actual like history ever. And so I think I read quite a bit about when Loving came out, about how Mildred Loving always felt more Native than she did Black, and how some of her ancestors felt, not ancestors, what am I trying to say? Descendants felt that was downplayed in the film, and I hadn't really heard about sort of that facet of America before, and it's fascinating how so much you just don't know if you don't know that you don't know it, and then you learn it, but you have to seek it out because it's not taught. And I think that's almost everything. I'm like rambling now. Sorry, it's 10 o'clock at night. That's why I love documentaries. The more documentaries I watch, the more I learn about things that I didn't even know I didn't know. And I'm somebody who just wants to know everything. I've got like a giant pile of books in my house where I just want to know everything I possibly can. And for some reason, I was never a big documentary fan until about 4 years ago. And actually, it was two documentaries that really got me thinking about the lack of representation of women and the lack of knowledge I had about creators who were women. And then the more I delved into that, some more documentaries I started watching. And I don't just watch documentaries by women, although this was directed by a woman. The more I realized that like the best stories are actually true stories, and the best films almost every year for the last several years that I've watched have all been documentaries. So this is my plug for documentary cinema. It's fantastic, and I wish I had watched more of it sooner. This was co-produced, I think, by PBS or co-released, so it might end up on PBS at some point. But you should definitely go see it in theaters if you can, because the music is so great. I want the soundtrack like right now. And just so many of these stories were so inspiring, and the connections between Native music and the way a lot of these musicians sang and played their instruments. When it's pointed out, you're like, oh shit, yeah. But you don't think about it when you're thinking about it, because we center so many things on whiteness. There was actually a part in the documentary that made me a little uncomfortable, and I know that the talking head guy didn't mean it, but it was one of the members of I guess it was either Black Sabbath or just Ozzy's band, I'm not sure, because they were talking about the drummer from the band who was native from New Mexico, and his the bassist was talking about how he didn't drum like a normal person, because he was trying to say that his drumming came from his native spiritual background, but the way he said not like a normal person, I was like, that's not what I know that's not what you meant, but that's what you said, and that really highlights what is the problem with most narratives in all aspects of history, in that we center it on whiteness and often white maleness, and then everything else that is divergent from that is othered, even though actually everything is othered at all times, because the only non-other is you and everything else is other. And the fact that we try to put everything in these little nomenclatures is actually like false, because nothing really is anything. I sound stoned, and I have never had pot in my life. I'm allergic. But I had a lot of deep thoughts while watching this movie, so you should go watch this. And there's a great movie coming out about Dolores Huerta that I cannot wait to watch. She's one of the great activists of our country, and I can't wait to see that one. It's coming out in a few weeks. This was Rumble, the Indians Who Rocked the World. I have rambled because I'm tired, but this movie was fantastic, and you should definitely check it out and listen to all this music, and really appreciate the true history of this country and try to learn more about it and have empathy for everyone, because that's, I think, what we lack in this country. And part of that is because we hide our history. I think history helps have empathy, and in a country that tries to bury its history, we then are unable to have empathy. My Siri just turned on, like she often does while I do these reviews. Everyone have a good night. Watch this film. Learn something new every day, really. It's great. It makes your brain expand. Have a good night.